the spring of 1942, something happened in a quiet Canadian prairie town that would shock the nation and expose the brutal reality lurking beneath the surface of wartime prison camps. Medicine Hat, Alberta, a peaceful community known for its stunning sunsets and friendly residents, became the site of one of the most disturbing incidents in Canadian military history. What unfolded there wasn't an escape attempt gone wrong or a riot that spiraled out of control. No, this was something far more sinister, something that revealed the dark underbelly of ideological fanaticism, even behind the barbed wire fences of a prisoner of war camp on Canadian soil. Here's what makes this story so haunting. We often think of World War II POW camps in Canada as relatively safe places, far from the front lines, where captured soldiers simply waited out the war. The Geneva Convention was in place, guards were trained, and everything seemed orderly. But what happened at Medicine Hat shattered that illusion completely. Behind those fences, Nazi ideology didn't just survive, it thrived, creating a shadow government among the prisoners that enforced Hitler's twisted beliefs with brutal efficiency. And when some prisoners dared to reject those beliefs, when they showed even a hint of doubt about the Reich or sympathy toward their captors, they paid the ultimate price. The Medicine Hat camp wasn't supposed to be a place of terror. It opened in 1939 and initially held prisoners captured during various operations in North Africa and Europe. These weren't just ordinary soldiers. Among them were hardened members of the Afrika Korps, Rommel's elite fighting force, and devoted members of the SS. They arrived in Canada expecting harsh treatment, expecting to be locked away in brutal conditions. Instead, they found something they never anticipated. Canadian guards who followed the rules of war, decent food, medical care, recreation time. For some prisoners, this humane treatment sparked something unexpected, a gradual realization that perhaps everything they'd been told about their enemies was wrong. But for the true believers, the fanatics who still clung to Nazi ideology with iron grips, this shift in thinking among their fellow prisoners was absolutely intolerable. You have to understand the psychology at work here. These hardcore Nazis saw themselves as more than prisoners. They saw themselves as soldiers still fighting the war from behind bars, maintaining discipline, preserving the purity of Nazi ideology, and punishing anyone they considered a traitor. They established what they called Kameradschaftsgericht, comradeship courts, secret tribunals that operated in the shadows, completely unknown to Canadian authorities. These weren't kangaroo courts in the traditional sense. They had prosecutors, judges, and strict procedures. They handed down sentences ranging from beatings to death, and they carried out those sentences with chilling precision. The first signs of trouble came in subtle ways. A prisoner would show up to morning roll call with bruises. Another would refuse to speak, his eyes darting nervously at certain inmates. Guards noticed tensions but couldn't quite pinpoint the source. The prisoners had developed an elaborate code of silence. Speaking to Canadian authorities about internal camp matters was considered the worst form of betrayal. Even prisoners who wanted to cooperate with investigations found themselves trapped between two terrible choices: face retribution from their fellow inmates or risk being labeled a traitor by speaking up. Then came the murders. The first victim was found hanging in one of the barracks. Canadian authorities initially ruled it a suicide. After all, depression was common among POWs separated from their families, uncertain about their futures. But some guards weren't convinced. The circumstances felt wrong. The prisoner had seemed in good spirits recently. He'd been learning English, talking about what he'd do after the war. One guard remembered him saying he was grateful to be out of the fighting, that he'd seen enough death. This didn't sound like someone about to take his own life. More deaths followed, each one staged to look like suicide or accident. A prisoner drowned during a supervised swim. Another fell from a height in the exercise yard. The camp doctor began noticing patterns. The victims all shared certain characteristics. They'd been friendly with guards. They'd expressed anti-Nazi sentiments. they'd refuse to participate in secret meetings held after lights out. But without concrete evidence, without witnesses willing to come forward, Canadian authorities were powerless to prove murder. The breaking point came with the death of Auguste Plac. Unlike the previous victims, Plac's murder was impossible to disguise as anything but what it was, a brutal execution. On a cold morning in September 1943, guards found Plac's body in the latrine. He'd been beaten so severely that his own mother wouldn't have recognized him. His skull was fractured in multiple places. Ribs were broken. The medical examiner counted over 40 distinct injuries. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't suicide. This was a message, a warning to anyone else who might be thinking about abandoning Nazi ideology. The Canadian military finally launched a serious investigation. They brought in intelligence officers, interrogation specialists, and translators fluent in German military slang. They separated prisoners into different sections of the camp, trying to break the code of silence. They offered protection to anyone willing to testify. Slowly, painfully, the truth began to emerge. What investigators uncovered was more organized and more terrifying than anyone had imagined. The camp had essentially two governments. On the surface, there was the official prisoner committee that liaised with Canadian authorities, organized recreation activities, and handled minor disputes. But beneath that facade operated the real power structure, a shadowy network of Nazi true believers who enforced party discipline with the same ruthlessness they'd shown on the battlefield. These weren't random thugs. They were intelligent, organized, and absolutely committed to their cause. They kept detailed records of each prisoner's loyalty, noting who attended their secret meetings, who sang the Horst Wessel song with proper enthusiasm, who gave the Hitler salute with conviction. The punishments they handed down followed a strict hierarchy. Minor infractions, like failing to attend a meeting or showing insufficient enthusiasm, earned warnings. Repeated offenses meant beatings, carried out by designated enforcers who worked in groups to avoid identification. The most serious crime, betraying Nazi ideology or cooperating with camp authorities, carried a death sentence. The comradeship courts would hold a trial, usually lasting just minutes. The accused rarely got to defend himself. Witnesses were either intimidated or recruited from the ranks of true believers. The verdict was almost always predetermined. Then came the execution, staged to look natural, carried out by multiple prisoners so no single individual bore full responsibility. Auguste Plac's crime. He'd done something incredibly brave and incredibly foolish. He told a Canadian guard that prisoners were planning an escape. No escape was actually being planned, but Plac had been threatened by the secret court for previous infractions, and he was terrified. He thought that by providing information, even false information, he could prove his value to the Canadians and secure protection. Instead, word of his betrayal spread through the prisoner network within hours. The court convened that same evening. By the next morning, Plac was dead. The investigation into his murder revealed the extent of the shadow government's reach. Canadian authorities arrested 12 prisoners suspected of involvement in the killing. But here's where things got even more complicated. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs couldn't be tried in civilian courts for crimes committed within the camp. They fell under military jurisdiction, yet the evidence was circumstantial at best. The prisoners who'd actually carried out the beating were protected by dozens of alibis from fellow inmates. The ones who'd ordered the execution had been careful to leave no paper trail, no concrete proof of their involvement. The investigators knew who was responsible, but proving it in a court-martial was nearly impossible. Meanwhile, word of the Medicine Hat murders spread to other POW camps across Canada. There were dozens of these camps, holding tens of thousands of German prisoners. Intelligence officers started reviewing deaths that had previously been ruled suicides or accidents. A disturbing pattern emerged. In camps with large concentrations of SS troops or Afrika Korps veterans, suspicious deaths were significantly more common. The same pattern of bruising, the same staging techniques. the same profile of victims who'd shown anti-Nazi tendencies or friendly behavior toward captors. The Canadian government faced a terrible dilemma. They couldn't simply release information about the murders to the public. Canada was still at war, and revealing that Nazi ideology was alive and well in POW camps might cause panic. It might lead to vigilante violence against prisoners. It might give ammunition to German propaganda claiming that prisoners in Allied hands were being mistreated. So the investigation continued quietly, behind closed doors, away from newspaper headlines and radio broadcasts. Inside the camps, Canadian authorities implemented new security measures. They separated suspected Nazi fanatics from more moderate prisoners. They planted informants, German-speaking soldiers who posed as prisoners and reported back on secret meetings and court proceedings. They conducted surprise inspections at random hours, disrupting the shadow government's ability to meet and organize. Most importantly, they began offering genuine protection to prisoners willing to testify, moving them to separate facilities where they couldn't be reached by the enforcers. Gradually, cracks appeared in the wall of silence. Some prisoners, sickened by the violence, started talking. Others, sensing that Germany was losing the war, decided their loyalty to the Reich wasn't worth dying for. A few acted out of simple decency, unwilling to stand by while innocent men were murdered for the crime of thinking independently. Each testimony added another piece to the puzzle, another connection in the network of conspirators who turned the camp into their own private totalitarian state. The trials finally began in early 1944. Under military law, the proceedings were closed to the public. No reporters attended. No family members watched from gallery seats. Just military prosecutors, defense attorneys, the accused, and a panel of officers serving as judges. The testimony was devastating. Witnesses described the secret courts in detail, explaining how sentences were determined, how executions were carried out, how evidence was disposed of. They named names, pointed out the ringleaders, described the hierarchy of power that had allowed a handful of fanatics to terrorize an entire camp. The verdicts came down hard. 5 prisoners were convicted of murder in the death of August Plac. 3 received death sentences. 2 got life imprisonment with hard labor. Another 7 were convicted of lesser charges related to the comradeship courts and received sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years. But even these convictions didn't solve the deeper problem. The ideology that had motivated the murders was still alive in the camps. The true believers hadn't been converted by verdicts and sentences. They'd simply been forced to operate more carefully, more quietly. Canadian authorities realized they needed a more comprehensive solution. They began a program of denazification, bringing in psychologists, former German political prisoners who'd fled to Canada before the war, and clergymen to challenge the prisoners' beliefs. They showed newsreels of concentration camps being liberated, confronting the prisoners with evidence of atrocities committed in their names. They held discussion groups, forcing prisoners to grapple with the reality of what their regime had done. Some prisoners broke down, overwhelmed by the horror they'd been part of. Others remained defiant, insisting the films were propaganda, the testimonies were lies, the evidence was manufactured by conspirators. The resistance to denazification was fierce. Some prisoners saw it as psychological torture, an attempt to break their spirits and force them to betray everything they'd fought for. They organized counter-programming, holding secret meetings where they reinforced Nazi ideology, reminded each other of their duty to the fatherland, and steeled themselves against Canadian influence. The shadow government adapted, becoming even more secretive, even more selective about who they trusted. The violence decreased, not because the ideology had weakened, but because the fanatics had learned to be more subtle. After the war ended in 1945, the repatriation process began. Thousands of German POWs were sent back to a homeland they barely recognized, divided between occupation zones, devastated by bombing, grappling with the horror of what had been done in Germany's name. But before they left Canada, every prisoner was screened. Those identified as hardcore Nazis, those suspected of involvement in camp murders or violence, were held back. Some faced additional criminal charges. Others were simply kept in custody longer, waiting until the new German government was ready to prosecute them. The Medicine Hat murderers who'd received death sentences faced execution in Canada. The hangings were carried out quietly, without fanfare, at military facilities away from public view. The condemned men showed no remorse. They went to their deaths convinced they'd been loyal soldiers, punished by a victor's justice that had no legitimacy in their eyes. Their fellow prisoners regarded them as martyrs, men who'd stayed true to the cause even when defeat was inevitable. It was a chilling reminder that ideology, once deeply embedded, can survive any amount of evidence, any level of suffering, any confrontation with reality. The prisoners who testified against the murderers faced a different kind of punishment. When they were eventually repatriated to Germany, many found themselves shunned by their communities. Former soldiers who'd learned of their testimony through the prisoner network spread word that they were traitors, informants who'd betrayed their comrades. Some received death threats. A few disappeared, their fates never fully explained. The shadow government's reach had extended beyond the barbed wire, beyond the war itself, into the complicated moral landscape of post-war Germany, where questions of loyalty and betrayal had no easy answers. For Canada, the Medicine Hat murders forced a reckoning with assumptions about how war worked, about the nature of prison camps, about the permanence of ideological indoctrination. Canadian authorities had believed that treating prisoners humanely would naturally lead to a softening of their beliefs, that exposure to democratic values and decent treatment would convert fanatics into reasonable men. Medicine Hat proved that assumption tragically wrong. Some believers couldn't be reached by kindness. Some ideologies were so deeply rooted that nothing short of total defeat and overwhelming evidence could dislodge them, and sometimes not even that was enough. The camp at Medicine Hat closed in 1946. The buildings were dismantled, the barbed wire rolled up, the guard towers torn down. The land returned to civilian use, but the memory of what happened there lingered. Veterans who'd served as guards carried the burden of knowing they'd presided over murders without realizing it, that men had been killed right under their noses despite their best efforts to maintain security. The investigators who'd uncovered the shadow government grappled with the knowledge that they'd only scratched the surface, that many murders had gone unsolved, many perpetrators had escaped justice. In the decades that followed, historians slowly pieced together a more complete picture of what happened in Canadian POW camps during the war. They discovered that Medicine Hat wasn't unique. Similar shadow governments had operated in other camps. Similar murders had occurred. The exact number of prisoners killed by their fellow inmates will never be known with certainty, but estimates range from dozens to over 100 across all Canadian facilities. Each death represented a failure of the system to protect men under its care, but also a testament to the frightening power of totalitarian ideology to maintain control, even in captivity. The Medicine Hat story challenges comfortable narratives about World War II. We want to believe that the good guys were purely good, that evil was confined to the enemy, that justice prevailed in the end. But the reality was messier. Good people made mistakes. Evil found ways to persist even in defeat. Justice was partial, incomplete, complicated by politics and practicality. The prisoners who died in Medicine Hat weren't saints. Some had been Nazi Party members themselves before developing doubts, but they'd reached for something better, a recognition that perhaps there were values more important than blind loyalty, and they'd paid for that realization with their lives. Today, there's very little physical evidence of what happened at Medicine Hat. No memorial marks the site. No museum preserves the story. You can drive through the area and never know that this quiet patch of Alberta prairie was once the site of brutal murders, secret courts, and a shadow war fought between prisoners separated from the actual battlefield by thousands of miles. The silence isn't accidental. After the war, Canada wanted to move on, to focus on rebuilding and reconciliation rather than dwelling on the darker chapters of the conflict. The families of murdered prisoners, if they even knew the truth about how their loved ones died, had no platform to demand recognition or justice. But forgetting comes with a cost. The Medicine Hat murders contain lessons that remain relevant. They remind us that ideology can be incredibly resilient, that true believers will go to extraordinary lengths to preserve their worldview even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of its failures. They demonstrate how easily isolated communities can develop their own justice systems, their own moral codes, operating entirely outside the awareness of official authorities. They show that treating people humanely, while morally correct and strategically important, isn't a magic solution to deeply held beliefs shaped by years of propaganda and indoctrination. The guards who worked at Medicine Hat during those dark years mostly took their experiences to their graves. A few gave interviews later in life, speaking carefully about what they'd witnessed, about the guilt they felt for not recognizing the danger signs sooner, about the powerlessness of trying to maintain order when the real power structure was invisible. One former guard described walking through the barracks late at night and feeling eyes on him, sensing the hatred from prisoners who saw him not as an individual, but as a symbol of everything their ideology taught them to despise. Another recalled a prisoner who'd approached him days before being found dead, clearly wanting to say something important, but fear had kept him silent until it was too late. The psychological toll on everyone involved was immense. The prisoners who'd participated in the murders carried the weight of taking human life, justified in their minds by loyalty to a cause that history would judge as monstrous. The prisoners who'd witnessed the violence but remained silent lived with the knowledge that their fear had allowed evil to flourish. The victims' families, when they eventually learned the truth, faced the agonizing realization that their loved ones hadn't died heroically in battle, but had been murdered by their own countrymen in a prison camp thousands of miles from home. The Canadian personnel who'd failed to prevent the murders, despite their best efforts, grappled with feelings of professional failure and moral responsibility. In the broader context of World War II, the Medicine Hat murders might seem like a minor footnote. Millions died in combat. Millions more perished in death camps. The scope of the war's destruction was almost incomprehensible, but focusing only on the big picture misses something crucial about human nature and the nature of evil. The Medicine Hat story shows us that atrocity doesn't always require massive machinery of death. Sometimes it happens in small spaces, carried out by a handful of determined individuals against victims who have no defense, no escape, no hope of justice. These small-scale horrors matter because they reveal how ordinary people can become perpetrators when ideology provides justification and circumstances provide opportunity. The Canadian government's handling of the situation reflects the complicated moral calculations of wartime. They couldn't publicize the murders without potentially endangering other prisoners or providing propaganda material to the enemy. They couldn't simply punish all suspected Nazis without violating the Geneva Convention and inviting retaliation against Canadian POWs held in Germany. They couldn't move too slowly without allowing more murders to occur. They couldn't move too aggressively without destabilizing the entire camp system. Every decision involved trade-offs, compromises, accepting imperfect solutions because perfect ones weren't available. What happened at Medicine Hat also raises uncomfortable questions about collective guilt and individual responsibility. Were all the prisoners who knew about the shadow courts but did nothing guilty of complicity? Were the ones who participated in non-lethal punishments less culpable than the actual killers? What about prisoners who'd been coerced into participating through threats against themselves or their families back in Germany? These questions didn't have clear answers in 1943, and they still don't today. War creates moral gray zones where traditional notions of right and wrong become blurred, where good people make terrible choices, where survival sometimes requires betraying your conscience. The legacy of Medicine Hat extends beyond the specific events that occurred there. It influenced how Canada handled POW camps in subsequent conflicts. It informed policies about prisoner separation, ideological screening, and intervention in prisoner hierarchies. It contributed to broader understanding of how extremist groups maintain control in closed environments. Mental health professionals, criminologists, and military strategists have all studied the Medicine Hat case, drawing lessons about group dynamics, coercion, and the persistence of ideological indoctrination. For the senior generation who lived through World War II or grew up in its immediate aftermath, the Medicine Hat story might resonate in personal ways. Perhaps you knew someone who served in the military during the war. Perhaps you heard whispered conversations about things that happened but weren't supposed to be discussed. Perhaps you sensed that the neat narrative of good versus evil wasn't quite complete, that there were complications and ambiguities that didn't make it into official histories or Hollywood movies. Understanding what happened at Medicine Hat doesn't require us to judge the people involved too harshly. The Canadian Guards were doing their best in an impossible situation. The prisoners who remained silent were often paralyzed by fear. Even some who participated in the violence were themselves victims of indoctrination, raised in a system that rewarded conformity and punished independent thought. But understanding also requires us to acknowledge the full truth, to recognize that evil found fertile ground even in a POW camp in peaceful Alberta, that ideology's grip can be stronger than common humanity, that looking away from uncomfortable truths doesn't make them disappear. The darkest chapter of Canada's POW history wasn't written on a battlefield. It was written in the shadows of a prison camp, in secret courts held after lights out, in the silence of prisoners too terrified to speak up, in the deaths of men who dared to question what they'd been taught to believe. It's a chapter that reminds us why remembering is important, why studying history means confronting not just the triumphs, but also the failures, not just the heroes, but also the victims whose names we've forgotten. The prisoners who died at Medicine Hat deserved better from their fellow inmates, from the system that was supposed to protect them, and from history that has largely overlooked their story. Telling their story now, decades later, doesn't change what happened, but it honors their memory and preserves the lessons their deaths can teach us about the enduring dangers of extremism, the importance of speaking truth even when it's dangerous, and the tragic consequences when silence becomes complicity.